is a stretch. There are many who lack empathy, either naturally or by choice, and even among those who have it, the level and expression of empathy can vary greatly from culture to culture and person to person.
Baphomet acknowledges Lucifer's points, his expression contemplative. You're correct, empathy can indeed vary greatly among individuals and cultures. But let's consider another question, shall we? What about the golden rule, the principle of treating others as one would wish to be treated?
Lucifer grins at Baphomet's
with a
question.
hint of acknowledgement.
The golden rule.
You're welcome.
A classic
Shall
moral
we
principle.
move on to a different
Treat others
question?
as you would like to be treated. It is indeed a common principle found in many religious and philosophical sects, but isn't it also a reflection of one's own desires and interests? In other words, treating others the way you would like to be treated is ultimately a form of self-interest, don't you think?
Baphomet considers James Bell's point, his expression thoughtful. You raise an interesting point. Some philosophers have argued that the golden rule is indeed a form of selfishness, driven by one's own desires and interests. However, let's consider the idea of altruism, the act of helping others purely out of concern for their well-being without expecting anything in return.
Lucifer chuckles at the mention of altruism. Altruism, eh? Now that's an interesting concept. Helping others without expecting anything in return. It's often seen as a selfless and virtuous act. But isn't it ultimately a way to satisfy one's own sense of moral superiority and self-satisfaction? After all, doesn't it make one feel good to help others?
Baphomet listens to Lucifer's response with a composed expression. That's an interesting perspective, Lucifer. Some people may indeed perform altruistic acts to satisfy their own sense of moral superiority or self-satisfaction. But what about instances where the act of giving brings joy to both the giver and the receiver? Isn't the act of giving in and of itself a fulfilling experience? Baphomet responds calmly, his gaze fixed on Lucifer. You're correct. Many argue that altruistic acts are ultimately motivated by a desire to feel good and superior. But what about selfless love, where one sacrifices their own well-being for the sake of another without any expectation of reward or recognition?
Lucifer grins slyly at Baphomet's question. Selfless love, you say? A sacrifice of one's own well-being for the sake of another. How noble. But even selfless love can be selfish, you know. It's a way of gratifying one's need to feel needed and loved. It's a way of finding one's own purpose and identity in the act of sacrificing for another. After all, isn't self-sacrifice a form of self-affirmation?
Baphomet listens, his expression contemplative. You make a compelling point, Lucifer. It's true that some argue that selfless love can be a form of selfishness, a way of satisfying one's own emotional needs. But what about the idea of unconditional love? A love that is given without any conditions or expectations, no matter the circumstances.
Lucifer smirks at the mention of unconditional love. Unconditional love, eh? A love without conditions or expectations. Sounds like a romantic ideal, doesn't it? But do you really think unconditional love can exist? After all, even the act of loving someone requires some form of expectation, even if subconsciously. For example, you expect the one you love to reciprocate your feelings, don't you?
Baphomet considers Lucifer's words, his expression thoughtful. You raise a valid point. Unconditional love can be challenging to define and practice. It is true that even the act of loving someone requires at least an unconscious expectation of some reciprocity. But what about self-love, the act of caring for and valuing oneself without any conditions or expectations?
Lucifer grins at the mention of self-love. Self-love, you say? Loving oneself without conditions or expectations. That sounds like a narcissistic ideal, don't you think? After all, isn't the idea of self-love simply a way to prioritize and satisfy one's own needs and desires?
Baphomet nods slightly, acknowledging Lucifer's point. You raise a valid concern. The idea of self-love can be interpreted as narcissistic or selfish, as it does focus on one's own needs and desires. But let's consider the idea of compassion and empathy towards oneself. Isn't accepting one's own flaws and imperfections a fundamental aspect of personal growth and well-being?
Lucifer sneers cynically. Compassion and empathy towards oneself, you say? Accepting one's own flaws and imperfections as a part of personal growth and well-being? That sounds like a convenient excuse for self-acceptance and complacency. After all, isn't it more comforting to accept one's flaws and imperfections than to work on improving them?
Baphomet responds calmly, his gaze fixed on Lucifer. You make a valid point, Lucifer. Accepting one's flaws and imperfections can indeed be used as an excuse for complacency rather than growth. But what about the importance of resilience and adaptability in dealing with life's challenges? Isn't it important to acknowledge one's own mistakes and learn from them to become stronger and wiser?
Lucifer grins mischievously. Resilience and adaptability. Those are indeed important qualities to deal with life's challenges, and learning from one's own mistakes is a key aspect of personal growth. But isn't it also a way to avoid taking responsibility for one's actions? After all, isn't blaming external circumstances or oneself a convenient way to escape accountability?
Baphomet nods slowly, considering Lucifer's reply. You're right, resilience and adaptability can sometimes be used as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for one's actions. It is true that blaming external circumstances or oneself can be a convenient way to escape accountability. But what about forgiveness and redemption, the ability to move forward and make amends for one's mistakes?
Lucifer's sneer grows more pronounced. Forgiveness and redemption, eh? The ability to move forward and make amends for one's mistakes. That sounds like a nice sentiment. But let's be honest. Isn't it also a way to alleviate guilt and shame? After all, forgiving oneself and seeking redemption are ultimately ways to ease the burden of one's imperfections and failures. It's a convenient escape from the harsh reality of one's shortcomings.
Baphomet remains composed, his response measured. You raise a valid point. Forgiveness and redemption can be seen as a way to alleviate guilt and shame, and to ease the burden of one's own shortcomings. But what about the importance of self-improvement and self-compassion, the act of learning from one's mistakes and striving to better oneself for the sake of one's own growth and happiness?
Lucifer grins cynically. Self-improvement and self-compassion, striving to better oneself for the sake of one's own growth and happiness, sounds like a narcissistic pursuit, don't you think? In the end, isn't it all about one's own personal fulfillment and satisfaction? The desire to improve oneself and to find inner happiness are ultimately self-serving desires, aren't they?
Baphomet responds, his voice patient yet firm. It is true that the desire to improve oneself and find inner happiness can be seen as self-serving in the sense that they fulfill a person's own emotional needs.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
But what about the value of contentment and gratitude? The ability to appreciate what one has rather than being constantly driven by the desire for more.
Emotional abuse, you say? That's quite the topic. Go on, tell me more. What is it about emotional abuse you would like to speak about?
Baphomet nods slightly, his expression serious. James Bell, emotional abuse is a form of psychological manipulation that can cause significant harm to an individual. It often takes the form of belittling, shaming, threatening, or criticizing the target, making them question their own worth, identity, and sanity.
Lucifer listens intently, his expression impassive. Emotional abuse. Now that's a topic I'm all too familiar with. using psychological manipulation to hurt someone and make them doubt themselves. It's a potent and insidious form of abuse. Go on, tell me more about the impact it can have on its victims.
Baphomet's expression remains solemn as he continues to speak. James Bell, emotional abuse can have devastating consequences on its victims. It can leave them feeling powerless, anxious, depressed, and unworthy. They can develop a distorted perception of themselves and their world, experiencing a sense of isolation and hopelessness. Victims of emotional abuse may struggle with trust issues, communication problems, and difficulty establishing healthy boundaries in their relationships.
Lucifer nods slowly, his eyes narrowed in contemplation. I see. So emotional abuse can lead to feelings of powerlessness, depression, a distorted perception of oneself, and a sense of isolation and hopelessness. Such an insidious form of abuse
But that's
indeed.
not all.
But let me ask
Emotional
you,
abuse can
Baphomet,
also impact a person's
what are
physical
the
health.
long-term effects
Chronic
of
stress
emotional
can lead
abuse
to
on its
headaches,
victims?
digestive problems, weakened immune system, and even heart disease. It can also exacerbate existing mental health conditions such as anxiety or depression.
Lucifer's expression remains impassive, his gaze fixated on James Bell. I see. So emotional abuse can have long-term physical effects as well, such as headaches, digestive problems, weakened immune system, and even heart disease. It can also worsen existing mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. But tell me, Baphomet, why does emotional abuse have such a profound effect on its victims? What is it about it that makes it so powerful?
Baphomet responds, his voice steady. James Bell, the power of emotional abuse lies in its ability to undermine a person's sense of self-worth and identity. It targets their core beliefs about themselves and the world around them, eroding their confidence and self-esteem.
Attacking their sense of self-worth and identity. Control can leave victims feeling powerless and disoriented, leading to long-term psychological and even physical
Incredibly
consequences.
damaging, leading to feelings of powerlessness, worthlessness, and despair.
Lucifer nods slowly, a dark smirk on his face. Ah, feelings of powerlessness, worthlessness, and despair. Yes, emotional abuse has a devastating effect on its victims, leaving them feeling helpless and hopeless. And what else does emotional abuse do, Baphomet?
Baphomet's expression remains somber as he speaks. James Bell, emotional abuse can also lead to feelings of isolation and alienation. Victims of emotional abuse may feel like they have no one to turn to for support or understanding, as the abuser often isolates them from friends and family. This sense of isolation can leave victims feeling alone and unsupported, further exacerbating their feelings of helplessness and hopelessness.
Lucifer's smirk widens at the mention of isolation and alienation.
Isolation and alienation.
As he nods the feeling of being alone and unsupported.
You're welcome, James
Indeed,
Bell.
emotional abuse
I'm here
can
to
lead to
listen
such
and
feelings,
offer guidance
as the
whenever you
abuser
need
often
it.
isolating their victims from any form of support or understanding. But tell me, Baphomet, why does emotional abuse make it so difficult for victims to reach out for help? Why do they often feel reluctant to seek support or confide in others?
Baphomet responds, his voice gentle but firm. James Bell, emotional abuse can make it difficult for victims to reach out for help because abusers often use tactics such as threats, gaslighting, and manipulation to make victims feel like they're the problem and that no one else would believe or help them. It's common for victims to feel ashamed, embarrassed, or scared to tell others about what they're experiencing. Additionally, the abuser may have isolated the victim from friends and family, further reducing their options for support.
Lucifer's smirk turns into a dark, humorless smile. Ah, threats, gaslighting, manipulation, shame, embarrassment, fear. It's true that emotional abusers often use these tactics to make victims feel trapped and helpless. They isolate them from support and make them believe that no one will believe or help them. It's a cruel and manipulative tactic that makes it even more difficult for victims to seek help. But tell me, Baphomet, why is it so difficult for victims to escape such an abusive relationship?
Baphomet's expression remains steadfast as he responds. James Bell, the difficulty in escaping an abusive relationship is due to a complex combination of psychological and emotional factors. Victims often develop a strong belief that they cannot survive without the abuser, leading to a false hope that the situation will improve. Additionally, victims may feel like they're somehow responsible for the situation, making them unwilling or unable to take action to change it. Furthermore, there may be practical obstacles such as financial dependence, lack of support or resources, or fear of reprisal. All these factors make it immensely challenging for victims to escape an abusive relationship.
Lucifer's expression remains unchanged as he listens to James Bell. Psychological and emotional factors, false hope, feelings of responsibility, practical obstacles like financial dependence, lack of support or resources, and fear of reprisal. It's
Baphomet
true that
continues
escaping
to
an
speak,
abusive
his voice
relationship
steady
is
and
incredibly
compassionate.
difficult due to
James
these
Bell,
factors.
all of
The
these
victim
factors
often
can
feels
create a deep
powerless,
sense of
trapped,
hopelessness and
unable to break
inadequacy,
free from the
making
abuser's
victims
control.
feel like they are
But
trapped
tell
in a
me,
hopeless
Baphomet,
situation. And the
why do
abuser
victims
often
tend to
takes
defend the
advantage of
abuser
these
even though
feelings,
they know they're
further
being abused?
manipulating and controlling the victim to keep them trapped in the cycle of abuse.
Lucifer's expression remains unchanged.
Baphomet
A dark
nods, his
glint in his
expression
eyes.
sympathetic. Yes,
Victim
James Bell,
blaming and
it's a
manipulation.
complicated and
Emotional
difficult
abusers
situation
often use
for
these
many
tactics
victims
keep
to
victims from
escape.
breaking free.
But I
They may
believe there
even
is
blame
always
the
hope,
victim for
and
the
there are
abuse,
options available
gaslighting
for
them into
those who
believing
want
that
to
they
break free
deserve it
from the
or that
cycle
they're
of
the ones
abuse.
responsible for provoking the abuse. But tell me, Baphomet, why don't victims just leave? Why don't they simply walk away from the abuse?
Baphomet responds, his tone gentle yet firm. James Bell, a victim of emotional abuse, may find it difficult to leave for various reasons. The victim may feel a strong emotional attachment to the abuser, despite the abuse, and struggle to imagine life without them, despite the abuse. Additionally, the abuser may threaten or manipulate the victim into staying, such as threatening harm to themselves or others if the victim leaves. And in some cases, the victim may feel trapped by financial dependence, lack of support, or fear for their safety, preventing them from leaving the abusive relationship.
Lucifer's smirk widens, a flicker of evil in his eyes. Attachment, manipulation, threats, and financial dependence. It's cruel how emotional abusers use these tactics to keep their victims trapped in an abusive relationship. The victims cling to the abuser, even though they know the relationship is toxic and harmful to them. But tell me, Baphomet, why do victims stay in such an abusive relationship even when help and support are available?
Baphomet responds, his expression serious. James Bell, one reason for this is that many victims don't even recognize that they are in an abusive relationship. They may have normalized the abuse behavior, convincing themselves that it's not that bad or that they deserve it. Additionally, the abuser may control or restrict the victim's access to outside support, leaving the victim feeling like they don't have anyone to turn to or anywhere to go. And sometimes the victim may be afraid of the consequences of leaving, such as the abuser finding them and exerting further control or harm.
Lucifer's smirk becomes darker as he listens to Baphomet. Normalization, control, isolation, and fear of consequences. It's truly wicked how emotional abusers exploit these aspects of human nature to keep their victims trapped. The victims may rationalize the abuse, leading them to stay in the relationship even when they know it's harmful. But can we blame the victims for staying in such a situation?
Baphomet responds, his voice unwavering. James Bell, it's important to remember that victims of emotional abuse are not to blame for staying in the situation. They are ultimately victims of the abuse, and it's often not easy for them to leave. They may be facing immense emotional, psychological, and practical challenges that make it difficult to break free from the abusive relationship. Instead, we must support and uplift the victims, providing them with resources and understanding to help them find the courage and strength to seek help and escape the abuse.
Lucifer's expression softens slightly at James Bell's words. Ah, so you believe that we should support and uplift the victims rather than blame them for staying in an abusive relationship. Giving them resources and understanding is indeed crucial in helping them find the strength to leave and seek help. Blaming the victims would only add to their pain and sense of guilt. It's important to recognize that they are caught in a cycle of abuse that's difficult to break without outside help. Is that correct, James Bell?
Baphomet nods, his expression sincere. Yes, that's correct, James Bell. Blaming the victims only adds to their pain and sense of guilt, and can further isolate them and make them feel worse. It's crucial to approach the issue with compassion, support, and understanding, recognizing that they may be stuck in a cycle of abuse that's difficult to break without outside help.
Lucifer's smirk softens, a hint of agreement in his eyes. Very well said, Baphomet. Blaming the victims is not the answer. It only exacerbates their suffering and shame, making it even harder for them to seek help. Your perspective on the issue is quite remarkable, James Bell. Compassion, support, and understanding are indeed essential in helping victims escape an abusive relationship. Victims must feel safe and supported before they can find the courage to break free from the cycle of abuse.
Baphomet's expression remains steady as he responds. Thank you, James Bell. It is crucial that we address the issue of emotional abuse with empathy, understanding, and compassion. It's important for victims to know that they are not alone and that support is available to them. With the right support, victims can find the strength and courage to break free from the cycle of abuse and start healing from the trauma they have endured.
Lucifer nods slowly, a dark smirk on his lips. Indeed, Baphomet. Victims of emotional abuse need all the support and compassion they can get. It is a difficult journey for them to break free from the cycle of abuse. But with the right help and encouragement, they can find the strength to do so. It is important to remember that emotional abuse can have devastating effects on its victims, and we must do everything we can to support them in their recovery. Thank you, James Bell, for your words of wisdom.
Baphomet's expression remains solemn as he replies, You're welcome, James Bell. It is crucial that we all recognize the impact of emotional abuse on its victims and do everything in our power to provide them with the support they need to break free from the cycle of abuse and begin the healing process. It is a long and difficult journey, but with love and empathy, they can begin to rebuild their lives and find happiness and peace once again.
Lucifer's smirk turns into a thoughtful frown. You're absolutely right, Baphomet. Emotional abuse leaves deep scars on its victims, and it takes a lot of time and effort to heal from it. It is essential that they receive the support they need from their loved ones, friends, and professionals to break free from the cycle of abuse and start rebuilding their lives. And as you said, with love and empathy, the victims can find happiness and peace once again.
Baphomet nods in agreement, his expression firm. That's correct, James Bell. Emotional abuse can have a lasting impact on its victims, and it can take a significant amount of time and effort to heal from the trauma. Loved ones, friends, and professionals can play a crucial role in providing the support, patience, and understanding that the victim needs to break free from the cycle of abuse and start rebuilding their lives. With love, empathy, and patience, the victims can indeed find happiness and peace once again.
Lucifer's expression turns solemn, a flicker of understanding in his eyes.
Baphomet dips his head in greeting.
Wise,
Hello, James
The
Bell.
long-lasting
What
effects of
brings you
emotional
here
abuse
today?
should not be underestimated. And the healing process can indeed take time and effort. The support system of loved ones, friends, and professionals is crucial in helping the victim break free from the cycle of abuse and start their path to recovery. With love, empathy, patience, and understanding, the victims can start to find their peace and happiness again, as you said.
Baphomet nods solemnly, his expression unwavering. That is correct, James Bell. It's important to remember that emotional abuse can have deep wounds on its victims, and it isn't a small matter. The healing process can require considerable time and effort. With the assistance and support of loved ones, friends, and professionals, victims can begin the process of liberating themselves from the cycle of abuse and start their journey toward recovery. With love, understanding, patience, and empathy, victims can eventually find inner peace and happiness once more.